Good day. Rather than discuss a specific issue of international relations today, though there is, as always, lots going on around the world, I'm going to focus on one increasingly pressing topic for me, which is the disarray, or rather the incompetent level of leadership within the United States' foreign policy community. In particular, it's become increasingly clear to me that the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is not remotely up to his job. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, is out of his depth also, and it seems that the entire leadership of both the State Department and of the National Security Council are not doing their work effectively. Things are indeed becoming so bad that the president himself, Joe Biden, had to send his CIA director, William Burns, on a not-so-secret trip to Moscow to carry out negotiations on his behalf, cutting out the leadership of the State Department and of the National Security Council, in whom some people, at least within the US administration, appear to be losing faith. Now, I've discussed the William Burns visit, which on Locals. I've already done one program there, and I'm shortly going to do another, because it is a very interesting trip and one which reveals a great deal about US policy at the moment. But putting it aside, it is remarkable that we're seeing secret diplomacy return to the United States, but with the top official who is undertaking it, in theory, on the president's behalf, no longer somebody who works for the State Department or in the National Security Council, but the head of the intelligence service. Richard Nixon, when he sought unconventional methods of diplomacy, when he also needed to circumvent the State Department and the officials there, at least turned to his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, to do the work for him. This situation where the president is apparently unable to work, either, or at least has no confidence in, or has little confidence in, either his Secretary of State or his national security advisor, is, in my experience, unique in American history. Now, why do I say that Tony Blinken is not up to the job? Well, let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what has he actually managed to achieve since he was appointed to the post of Secretary of State? Relations with China are going from bad to worse. He's been agitating for a commitment to Taiwan, which, as I've said in program after program, the United States cannot fulfill. As a result, he is antagonizing the Chinese in ways that are not beneficial to the United States, and he is setting up a clash with China in a part of the world where the United States cannot win. He is also failing dismally to sort out any kind of relationship, or constructive relationship, with the Russians. The whole relationship with Russia continues to be bogged down, not just on the big hot button issues like Ukraine, arms control, and all the rest, but on a disastrous quarrel about representations in the US Embassy in Moscow and in US consulates across Russia, and in the Russian Embassy in New York and Russian consulates across America. The Russians have made it absolutely clear that for there to be any advance or progress in US-Russian relations at all, this problem of lack of diplomats in either country representing the other side needs to be resolved first. They point out absolutely correctly that this whole game of diplomatic expulsions was launched in the final days of the Obama administration, when Obama sanctioned Russia on the grounds that the Russians had interfered in the 2016 election. We've now seen a series of indictments in the United States of officials and of individuals who were connected with the whole Russiagate theory, and which are increasingly casting doubt on whether that meddling by Russia in the election in fact took place, or at least took place in the way that was alleged back in 2016 when Obama took that step. Besides, it's become absolutely clear that the diplomatic expulsion tit for tat and war, if you like, is working badly for the United States itself. It means that the United States cannot operate an embassy, an effective and functioning embassy in Moscow, and is not able to talk to the Russians in an effective way, as it needs to do if it is to conduct relations effectively with that nuclear superpower. Yet Blinken doesn't seem to give this issue any sort of priority. When the Russians bring up this topic with officials at Blinken's State Department, as they did, for example, with Victoria Nuland when she visited Moscow a few weeks ago, they find that the Americans are completely unreceptive and don't seem to understand the seriousness of this issue from a Russian perspective. So the result is that no real progress on any issue is being made with Russia, because even on this small issue of diplomatic representation, Blinken is unable to take the necessary step to break the impasse by coming along and coming to a pragmatic compromise with the Russians, which would lead to a resolution of this problem. It's striking that over the last few weeks and months, there have been virtually no meetings between Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov whatsoever. They did have a meeting, as I remember, at the Arctic Council some months ago, but that seems to me to have been their last substantive meeting. And when Blinken has attempted to speak to Lavrov over the telephone, it seems that the discussions between the two men have gone badly. So relations with Russia are not going well. Relations with China are going from bad to worse. And it gets worse elsewhere. There's been an extraordinary and very incisive article by the former Indian diplomat, M.K. Bhadrakumar, who is talking about how Blinken is mismanaging foreign policy, the US's foreign policy in the Middle East. And it actually appears to take almost the level of ridicule. It makes comments like this: US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is a man in a hurry. The president expects him to produce foreign policy success stories. Success stories are desperately needed as post-Afghanistan, the superpower has become a laughing stock universally. The transatlantic alliance is seriously disoriented, and Russia is on the prowl in the heart of Europe with natural gas to sell. The Iranians are yet to give a date for the resumption of talks on the US's return to the JCPOA. As for China, the less said, the better. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, senses a Sputnik moment. The Russian and Chinese warships exercise freedom of navigation on the forbidden seas of Japan's eastern coastline, littered with top-secret military installations. The list goes on and on. The unkindest cut of all is that the traditional client regimes in West Asia are also asserting they look to diversify their relations and project their power through broader alliances. And the more they look eastward, the deeper they engage with China. And then Badr Kumar, having set up the scene like this, goes into a detailed discussion about the disastrous state of US relations with the Gulf states, and refers to an actually very interesting article on this very topic that appeared in the Financial Times in September, which discusses how the Gulf states are steadily drifting away from the United States as they forge ever closer links with China. And this is what Badr Kumar has to say about this. Blinken must worry. The Chinese are Chinese, after all. After the US refused to sell armed drones to Gulf states, China had a deal to set up a drone factory, the Gulf's first, at Saudi Arabia's King Abdulaziz's City for Science and Technology. Things came to such a pass that the administration is agonizing that the sale of F-35 stealth fighter jets to the United Arab Emirates risks China gaining access to some of America's latest military technology. The Financial Times captured an incisive analysis of the state of play as more of China, less of America. And it then goes on to say that the Pentagon this is Badr Kumar, is also getting frantic. General Kenneth McKenzie, the commander of US Central Command, told a webinar earlier this year, we need to recognize that competition against Russia and China simply doesn't occur in the Western Pacific or the Baltic, that it occurs everywhere in places like the Middle East, where they're expanding and coming in. And then there is the really cruel part of Badr Kumar's analysis. Blinken is trained as an aide, drafting memos for senators in Congress. But all that has no reference to the Middle East, with a political culture steeped in intrigues, skullduggery, and cynical realism. In Blinken's place, Jared Kushner would have found a better way to communicate with the powerful Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Blinken must be a secret admirer of Kushner to steal so sheepishly the jewel in the crown of the roving prince in the Trump White House, the Abraham Accords. Blinken simply picked up the threads where Kushner left them and strove to do one better on the Abraham Accords. Possibly the Israelis advised Blinken, given their own growing unease over Iran's imminent surge with the lifting of sanctions and the US's retrenchment upturning the regional balance. But anyway, he then goes on to discuss the Abraham Accords and the way in which essentially Blinken is simply having to follow in Kushner's footsteps, with Kushner actually having made the diplomatic breakthrough there because of the cynicism with which Kushner is able to bring to these to foreign policy in the Middle East, which contrasts with Blinken's inexperience and naivety. But then, quite correctly in my opinion, Badr Kumar follows up by saying that the Abraham Accords are anyway misconceived and that they're all going to end badly in the end. And he discusses at length the recent coup in Sudan and how that in effect undermines the situation. And he points out that the whole thing is turning badly for the United States, and he finishes with these words. Blinken is wasting time creating cabals in the Middle East. It is a hopelessly discredited strategy to somehow keep the US embedded in West Asia when its diplomacy is clearly losing traction. What happens if the clutch goes while driving? And anyway, a scathing assessment of Blinken from a experienced former Indian diplomat. And I'm hearing the same thing in Europe. It's more difficult to get the Europeans to speak out openly about the inadequacies of the Secretary of State, the US Secretary of State. But if you go to to European media, to European newspapers, you will see enormous disillusionment and a widespread sense that the United States, which had been expected to re-engage effectively with Europe, to work with the Europeans successfully after the disruptive period of the Trump administration, well, the Europeans are bitterly disappointed. They sense that the US foreign policy team doesn't amount to very much, and that the United States fundamentally isn't really interested in them either. So, Blinken is failing as a Secretary of State with China, he's failing with Russia, he's failing in Europe, he's failing in the Middle East. As Badra Kumar correctly says, somebody whose training was to prepare memos for senators is not really fit or experienced enough or strong enough to be an effective Secretary of State. I would add that Blinken's continuous use of values and those kind of ideological talking points in his discussions with the leaders of the major powers must be increasingly grating. Another area where the United States has been completely frozen out of the diplomacy is Central Asia. We've seen the United States driven out of Afghanistan in the most humiliating way. We've seen the regional powers, led by China and Russia, coming together to try and find a way to stabilize the situation in Afghanistan. We've seen a recent conference in Moscow, chaired by the Russians, to talk about the situation in Afghanistan, and we've seen that the Russians sought to invite the United States to attend that meeting in Moscow. Blinken thought otherwise. He refused to attend the meeting in Moscow. He refused to work with the regional powers. He refused to talk to the Taliban, except at that meeting, at that traditional meeting place in Doha. The result is that whatever point Blinken and the foreign policy team in the United States think they're making, the reality is that the United States is becoming isolated on Afghan and Central Asian related topics. The Russians and the Chinese and the various regional powers, including, by the way, for this purpose, India, are busy sorting out the situation in Afghanistan with each other and are no longer talking to the United States because the United States is no longer a party to these discussions. Other countries are also starting to feel increasingly aggrieved. What about, let's talk about Turkey. Let's talk about President Erdogan there of Turkey. A difficult character at the best of times, somebody who never negotiates, who's never easy to negotiate with, somebody who is perhaps difficult to trust on many issues, but someone who nonetheless represents a country, Turkey, which is an important regional power in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East, which has a big role in Syria and which has a big role in Central Asia and the Caucasus also. Certainly someone that the United States needs to talk with, and certainly someone that the United States needs to engage with, given the fact that there are still US military bases in Turkey and given that Turkey remains a member of NATO. Well, relations with Turkey go from bad to worse. There's little sign of any constructive engagement with Turkey, certainly not on the part of the State Department. To the extent that negotiations are taking place between the Turks and the Americans, they seem to be largely conducted by officials in the Pentagon, with discussions underway about whether possibly the United States might agree to sell F-16 fighter jets to Turkey in place of the F-35 fighter jets, which the Turks had previously been promised, but which the United States has avoided selling because of the S-400 sale issue. Again, an active Secretary of State would be travelling to Turkey regularly, would be speaking to Erdogan, would be talking to Turkish officials, would be trying to understand their interests and concerns over Syria, the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, whatever, would be engaging with them continuously and would be trying to find some means to repair this important but very fraught relationship. I would add that the moment to do this is actually quite a good one. Erdogan is under a great deal of political and electoral pressure within Turkey itself. The Turkish economy is in poor straits. Inflation is now officially at 20%, and there's widespread feelings and resentment of Erdogan amongst many people in Turkey. Arguably, Erdogan would welcome some kind of deal with the United States at this time if it would relieve some of those domestic pressures upon him. And that might make him amenable for discussions with the United States at this time. However, in the absence of any actual movement from the State Department, from people like Blinken, it's difficult to see how that can happen, with the result that Erdogan, and with him Turkey, because on this Erdogan is not isolated, are slowly but steadily drifting ever further away from the United States and are making their own decisions and cutting their own deals. Straightforwardly, the United States has perhaps the least effective Secretary of State that I can remember. I mean, there were poor Secretary of States in the past. Rex Tillerson, Donald Trump's first Secretary of State, was an epic disappointment, for example. But Trump at least took the decision eventually to sack him. There's no sign at the moment that in Blinken's case that is going to happen. And that does need to happen very soon. We need to have a Secretary of State who is not just someone who is able to draft memos and come up with elegant phrases and come and face off the Chinese and be steamrolled over by them, as happened humiliatingly for him in Alaska. The United States needs someone who's an actual diplomat, a deal maker, a negotiator, somebody who's able to do the give and take, the hard grind of diplomacy, who's able to travel around capitals, who's able to engage people like Wang Yi of China, Sergei Lavrov of Russia, the various tough and wily diplomats of the Middle East, talk to people like Erdogan, talk to the Iranians, try to find some ways of developing a feel for international relations and a feel for how to move the United States' agenda forward whilst constantly interacting with these leaders. Even Iran, which arguably should have been a simple matter for the United States to sort out at the beginning of this year, the president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, was desperate to make a deal and was anxious to make it to get the United States on side with the JCPOA, and the United States, or the Biden administration, was saying that the JCPOA would be revived by the new administration. Even Iran, which is drifting away and integrating with the Eurasian powers, as it has seen a total absence of engagement and action on the part of the administration, and instead senses that it is faced with drift. So we have an ineffective Secretary of State, but we also have an ineffective and failing National Security Council. Jake Sullivan has had meetings with Chinese officials, which appear to have gone nowhere. He's had meetings with Russian officials, which appear to have gone nowhere. His handling of the Afghanistan affair is widely derided, and he is barely known in Europe and has had little interaction with European leaders. Far from the United States being back, it is practically invisible in most parts of the world, or if not invisible, widely derided. Take that disastrous trip by Kamala Harris to Singapore and to Vietnam that I discussed a few weeks ago. We saw Kamala Harris coming along to Singapore and to Vietnam, two important Asian countries which the United States wants to win over in its competition with China. And Kamala Harris says all the wrong and inappropriate things when she is there. And when she goes to Vietnam, she comes along with the program, the slogan, America is back, or one almost guaranteed to annoy the Vietnamese. She lays a wreath at the spot where the former Senator McCain was shot down, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was shot down bombing Vietnam, and makes all sorts of extraordinary statements about China, which compelled the Vietnamese to call in the Chinese ambassador while she is present in Vietnam to reassure him that, in fact, they shouldn't pay any heed to what Kamala Harris is saying. Well, all of that reflects badly on Kamala Harris, but of course it also reflects badly on the entire US foreign policy leadership. If the United States had an effective foreign policy leadership, the State Department, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and the National Security Advisor Council, Jake Sullivan, would have game planned the trip with Kamala Harris and her aides. They would have spotted all the mistakes and problems along the way, and we would have had a trip which would have avoided all these very obvious, in fact, blindingly obvious pitfalls. Instead, nothing like that seems to have happened. There doesn't seem to have been any proper planning or thinking about how to organize this trip, with the result that it went badly wrong and the United States stumbled, Kamala Harris stumbled at every obstacle. Or take another issue, North Korea. The North Koreans are pressing ahead with more missiles. They're now talking about building a nuclear-powered submarine which can launch sea-launched ballistic missiles at the United States. They claim to have tested a hypersonic missile system. They claim also to have developed a cruise missile. They seem to be forging ahead with their military technology, and Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, recently appeared at a display in Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, in which he showed off all of the new weapon systems that the North Koreans are developing. This is a serious question, a very alarming one. Where is the United States? Is it engaging with the North Koreans? Is it talking to them substantively on any issue? Well, the United States says publicly that it's prepared to meet with the North Koreans without setting any preconditions, but at the same time, it's not prepared to make any concessions. It's not prepared to discuss matters with the North Koreans. There's no suggestion, for example, of a US diplomat, a senior US diplomat, traveling to Pyongyang and trying to re-engage with Kim Jong-un and to find out what he's thinking and what sort of proposals he might want to make. And the result is that the situation with North Korea goes from bad to worse. Far from America being back, America at the moment is absent without leave. Things are going wrong everywhere, and they're going wrong at the same time, because the United States, as I have said, does not have an effective foreign policy team. Now, the responsibility for this ultimately lies with the man in the White House. And we all know, many people have discussed the problems that there are there. Unfortunately, the president doesn't seem to be able, at the moment, to get a grip on his administration. But if you have a president who is not able to act forcefully himself, he needs, at the very least, to find people who can run things for him when he is not there. Now, if the president relies upon somebody like William Burns, who is the director of the CIA, to conduct diplomacy for him, sending William Burns on a trip to Kabul, where Burns spoke with the Taliban, and now sending him on a trip to Moscow, where Burns spoke with the Russian leaders. If Burns is the person the president trusts, and if Burns is the only person who has the qualifications and the experience to conduct diplomacy on behalf of the United States, then what the president needs to do, what the officials who advise the president need to advise him to do, what the congressional leadership needs to advise the president to do, is to replace the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor with someone like Burns, perhaps Burns himself, so that Burns can take over and conduct diplomacy effectively. Now, I'm not rooting for William Burns. I don't actually know a huge amount about him, but I have heard that he is somebody with genuine foreign policy expertise. He was, after all, a ambassador, the US ambassador to Moscow during the Obama period, and most accounts suggest that he is a far more effective diplomat, at least in the conventional meaning of the word, than Blinken, Sullivan, and all of these individuals appears to be. So if it's Burns who's going to be the person who runs diplomacy for the United States, then put him in a post like Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, where he can do it effectively and properly. Anyway, whatever. This situation in which the United States is drifting because its foreign policy team is not up to standard cannot continue like this for much longer without some real harm being done. We saw in the summer over Afghanistan how the absence of a strong foreign policy team at the heart of American power meant that a withdrawal from Afghanistan was not carried out effectively or efficiently, because there was no one in overall charge and everything fell to pieces with nobody showing much interest in what was going on and nobody wanting to actually take responsibility for the debacle in Kabul. That problem, which, by the way, required, apparently, the dispatch of William Burns eventually to talk to the Taliban, that problem will be a minor problem compared with whatever real big crisis appears on the horizon before very long. Let's assume, for example, that there is a real standoff, a real confrontation with China over Taiwan, which is becoming increasingly possible, perhaps even likely. Does anybody really believe that in that kind of situation, Tony Blinken is the right person to speak to the Chinese and to try either to impress them or to cut deals with them or to negotiate with them? Does anybody believe that the Chinese have much respect for Tony Blinken in that kind of situation? Does anybody believe that if there is a crisis over Ukraine, Tony Blinken is the right person to send to speak to Sergei Lavrov. Surely the time has come to bring effective leadership to the US foreign policy team. Leaving the situation as it is at the moment, allowing this drift to continue, can only set up a situation where the United States, facing some big crisis around the world, and a crisis always comes, is going to be called up short with people who are in charge not up to their jobs. I cannot imagine a bigger recipe, a better recipe for a debacle than that. Anyway, that's my view. I would add that I have no personal animus against Mr. Blinken at all. I don't know him. Until a few months ago, I never even heard of him. That in itself, by the way, was, in my opinion, a good reason not to appoint him. Somebody who has risen invisibly in the way that both Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan have done was hardly the right person to occupy, or hardly the right people to occupy the leading positions in US diplomacy at a time of international tension such as we have today. In the past, the United States has had giant figures in charge of its diplomacy. One thinks of George Marshall, one thinks of Dean Acheson, one thinks indeed of Henry Kissinger, however strong one's feelings about him are. Even people like George Shultz and people like that in the past were effective and strong foreign policy leaders and people that other powers took seriously. It's time, more than ever, that the United States returned to that situation, with the United States defense establishment admitting that the United States is in a situation where great power competition has returned, where there are now 3 great powers instead of 1. It should be obvious that the United States cannot afford an incompetent Secretary of State like Tony Blinken is, or an incompetent national security advisor such as Jake Sullivan is. It's time for a change. It's time for a reshuffle, and let it happen soon. Well, thank you for joining me for this somewhat unusual program. I hope that you will understand that when I make it, I mean the best for the United States. As I said, if William Burns is the person who is now trusted to carry out diplomacy, then give him the job where he can carry it out properly. If it's not William Burns, well, bring in someone else. There is no shortage of people in the United States who are fully qualified and fully competent to fill the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor position. It's not for me to say who these people are. That's a matter for the United States, for the officials there, for the political leadership, for the president, first and foremost, to decide. But let's have no more of the Blinken-Sullivan, Laurel and Hardy Act. Let us have real people in charge who are able to run things effectively and who are not derided and ridiculed in the way that Blinken has just been by MK Bhadrakumar. Well, thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me soon in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also join us on our other platforms, especially locals, where we publish an increasing amount of exclusive material and analysis, where I've now done 3 live streams and where my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has also been busy publishing material, and where our Duran community, our vibrant Duran community are also active. We are also, of course, on other platforms like BitChute, Library, SuperU, Rumble, ODYSEE, and all the rest. And you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, t-shirts, sweatshirts, hats, hoodies, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs, and have a wonderful day until then.